This is a pre-review of the new Sony a6700 camera. Why should you watch a pre-review when you could watch a review by someone who's actually shot with one? Perhaps you shouldn't. But here's why you might want to stick around. My background is 100% shooting for the last 38 years as a full-time working pro. People spend too much time and energy comparing the features of digital cameras when they should be looking first at the sensors in the very heart of the cameras. Different than DSLRs that preceded mirrorless cameras, most of the mirrorless features are a direct result from their sensors. It's always good to take a closer look at the heart that pumps all those features out, rather than talking about the buttons and switches on the exterior of the body. So stick around and see what I mean. Let's get started. Let me translate the following gobbledygook from Sony's description of their new sensor inside the a6700. 26 megapixel Exmor-R APS-C BSI CMOS sensor. The 26 megapixel part you probably already got. Yeah, it's bigger than the 24.2 megapixel sensor, which has been inside every single APS sensor camera Sony has made since the a6300. You heard that right. After the a6000, Sony produced the a6300 back in March of 2016. I was in Las Vegas for that one and managed to sneak one out of the 3 bodies that were at WPPI. I got him out the back door and ran over to shoot college hoops at UNLV one night. The a6300 sensor was killer at that time and offered a major upgrade in quality across the board from the a6000. The main thing it offered was much improved low light performance with very little noise versus the a6000. Next, let's talk about the Exmor-R APS-C BSI, part of the description of the new sensor. Exmor is an imaginary land that Sony engineers dream about when they pause for a few seconds just twice a day as they slave away at their workstations. It's nice and warm in Exmor, with long deserted beaches, all-inclusive buffets, and most importantly, no deadlines and no Sony Alpha Rumors access. The APS-C thing you probably got, so that leaves the BSI part to explain. Now, many people think BSI stands for British Standards Institution, but that is erroneous. BSI stands for Backside Illuminated Sensor. Back in 2008, Sony invented this tech when they figured out a way to achieve twice the sensitivity in a chip with lower noise. Remember back to the time when you had to choose between a big file camera like a 1DS and a sports camera with a small sensor but great low noise at high ISOs like the D3S? The BSI part of the description means that Sony gives us both things in one at once. Here's the thing though, fast forward through the launch of the a6400, the a6600, the a6100, and the ZV-E10. Every one of those cameras had the same exact sensor inside as the a6300. If you own any of those bodies, I hate to tell you this, but your camera just got smoked by the a6700 that was launched just yesterday on July 12th, 2023. Every aspect of this new 26 megapixel sensor creates an extreme unfair advantage to every camera that came before in the APS-C segment. So it's a larger sensor capturing more information than before with better color, with lower noise and an overall improved look, no matter what you shoot. So you might ask yourself, how did Sony get away with putting the same sensor in all those cameras going back to 2016? And the answer is simple, through substantial improvements to the image processor in each iteration. From the a6300 to the a6600, the magical engineers at Sony figured out more and better ways to improve the photo and video quality by squeezing every pixel. Imagine all these tiny little garlic presses attached to the sensor with tiny tools and a microscope to do that work. Yeah, no. I have absolutely no idea how you squeeze a megapixel, and I'm fairly certain it's illegal here in the state of Tennessee anyways. Which brings me to my next point. The other thing that many reviewers won't mention is that this 26 megapixel sensor is not really new. It's been around since last year, September 29th, 2022, when the FX30 video camera was launched. Look at the a6700 as an FX30 with a viewfinder for $400 less, and it weighs less too. If you'd like to read more and learn more about that sensor, just watch reviews of the FX30 from last year, in which many people said, if only it had a viewfinder. The 14 stops of dynamic range in the a6700 is able to produce is partly because the 26 megapixel sensor, but the rest of the improved performance comes from how the engineers translate information coming off that sensor and send it to your SD card. This second capture, if you will, is seldom talked about, but discerning shooters understand it even if we don't know the first thing about how it's done. Introducing the new Sony Bionz XR image processor. This is where the magic happens. And so the new sensor was produced in Tokyo, and then imagine all these engineers get to attack it. These guys never sleep. I'm serious. Every time I see them in America when they come to big launch events or Condo, they all look tired. It's time for them to actually see and walk around under the actual sun. Getting back to the sensor and the image processor in the a6700, see how I got myself back on track there? I think the meds might actually be working. The combo of the new sensor and the processor means pixel peepers will be able to wind up that ISO to new heights never before attempted by mere mortals. One shooter that dropped a video on the new camera after actually using it said that the ISO was solid all the way up to 6400 ISO. Gerald Undone is not a news or sports photographer, so our collective need for less noise up in that stratosphere above 6400 will be satisfied. Of this I'm confident. After that, Topaz will take over and help us out even more. One major benefit of the a6700 not talked about as much is the 10-bit 422 feature. Now, if you don't know what all those numbers and double colon means, I looked it up in the dictionary for you. Those equally sized dots aligned vertically always precede an explanation, a list, or a quoted sentence. There are 2 colons in that code, so they must be important. 422 simply expresses the size or gamut of the color space possible with the a6700's chip. It's big, and that's the important thing you need to know. The larger that color space is, the more you can move your sliders in Lightroom or Capture One without things falling apart. It means that we can exert more control over our images, especially when we royally screw up our exposures out in the field. Of course, that never happens to me, and I'm sure it doesn't happen to you either. If you need more information about color gamut, just ask your friendly neighborhood video shooter. They'll get all excited to tell you about 422 as it makes their life easier in the edit bay. Oh, so much better. 10-bit times better, actually. While we're talking about video, let's also mention Gerald Undone's testing of the quick pan ability of the a6700. He says it's better than any of the Sony full-frame cameras, and it's really impressive. For still shooters, this has a very important translation to our world. Undone's testing of those quick pans he did also proves without a doubt that the a6700 will produce much better results when shooting sports with electronic shutter. There'll be much less jello and rolling shutter effects when shooting batters and golfers swinging. It's not going to be as good as the A9, but it will likely be the best APS-C camera to use for all types of action photography and birds in flight. The a6700 shares the same battery as the A1 and the newer full-frame cameras and the FX3 and FX30. This means 2 things that are really important. First, the battery life, especially on silent shutter, will be awesome. Second, it means that the grip is greatly enlarged from the previous cameras, even over the 6600. Every reviewer I watched on launch day talked about how good the camera felt in their hands. This sort of tactile feel is improved, and they even added the same exposure controls for shutter and aperture. So they're the same now as the full-frame cameras. So your index finger controls the aperture, and your thumb controls the shutter speed. Unless you choose to flip them in the menus, that is. You can even pinch on this little guy. Some reviewers complained about the lack of a joystick. This just means that they're not harnessing all the power of the autofocus that these newer cameras have by using tracking autofocus. You don't need a joystick when you master real-time tracking. So how much is this little baby, this a6700? It's $13.98 in the US Treasury greenbacks in the lower 48. And of course, more up where Tim Hortons serves up hot steep tea and the best donuts in the northern hinterlands. If you enjoyed this piece and you plan to buy an a6700, please, for God's sakes, use my affiliate link, as it will help me to keep producing content like this. Because contrary to popular belief, Sony doesn't pay me to make these posts or videos. The link is below in the description. Thanks so much for watching.